Captain Amara Whitfield's hands were still zip-tied behind her back when Lieutenant Marcus Felt walked into the booking hallway of the Everton Police Department, saw her sitting on the metal bench under the fluorescent lights, and stopped so abruptly that the 3 tactical officers behind him nearly collided with his back. For a full 3 seconds, nobody in that hallway moved. Then Felt's boots came together with a crack that echoed off the cinder-block walls. His hand snapped up to his brow in a salute so sharp it looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the building, and his voice, the voice that had spent the last 90 minutes calmly directing a hostage extraction 2 miles away, cracked slightly as he said, "Captain Whitfield, ma'am, what is your rank status right now? Are you still active?" Desk Sergeant Dale Kruger, who had spent the better part of 2 hours refusing to look up from his monitor every time Amara asked to make a phone call, nearly dropped the coffee mug in his hand. Detective Wendell Pruitt, who had told her twice that her story didn't add up and that she should save it for the arraignment, stood frozen in the doorway of the interview room, his mouth slightly open. And Amara Whitfield, 29 years old, 5'6", a fresh bruise blooming along her jaw from where an officer had shoved her into the cruiser's doorframe, looked up at the man saluting her, blinked once, and said in a voice that hadn't wavered once in the entire ordeal, "Discharged 11 months ago, Lieutenant. Medical. But I appreciate you asking before you decide whether to believe me. Before we continue, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and local time down in the comments below. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and I want to know exactly how far this one's gone." To understand how Amara Whitfield ended up zip-tied on a bench in the Everton Police Department on a Tuesday night in March, you have to go back 11 months, to the day the Marine Corps handed her a folder full of discharge paperwork and a small blue box containing a bronze star with a combat distinguishing device, and told her, with genuine sympathy and genuine finality, that her body would not be going back to Helmand Province, or anywhere else that required her to carry 60 pounds of gear at a dead run. She had been a captain in the United States Marine Corps, assigned to a military police battalion, when the vehicle she was riding in struck a pressure plate IED on a supply route 11 miles outside Sangin. 2 Marines in the vehicle behind hers died. The driver of her own vehicle, Corporal Denny Ruiz, lost his left leg below the knee. Amara herself took shrapnel to her right shoulder and a concussion severe enough that for 6 weeks she couldn't read more than a paragraph without a headache splitting her skull in half. She had pulled Ruiz out of the burning vehicle with her non-dominant arm, applied a tourniquet with her teeth and her good hand, and kept him talking until the medevac bird arrived, an act that, 8 months later, earned her the Bronze Star with Valor and a permanent 40% disability rating in her right shoulder that meant she would never again pass a Marine Corps physical fitness test. She came home to Everton, Georgia, a mid-sized city of about 90,000 people, built around a defunct textile mill and a growing logistics corridor off Interstate 16, because her mother, Dolores Whitfield, still lived in the same brick house on Sycamore Terrace where Amara had grown up, and because Everton High School needed a junior rotic instructor and the pay, while modest at $46,000 a year, came with a pension credit that stacked onto her military time. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment at the Magnolia Court complex on Ridgeline Avenue for $875 a month, kept her military footlocker at the foot of her bed exactly the way she'd kept it in the barracks, and spent 3 evenings a week at Cornerstone Physical Therapy on Delacroix Road, working her shoulder back into something resembling function. Her physical therapist, a patient, wiry man named Oren Castellano, had taken to timing her range of motion exercises against a stopwatch, not because it mattered clinically, but because he'd figured out early that Amara Whitfield responded better to a challenge than to encouragement. 78 degrees, he'd tell her, marking it on her chart. You were at 71 in January. You're not broken, Captain. You're just recalibrating. She appreciated that he never once used the word disabled without her permission, and that he'd been the one to suggest, back in November, that she start swimming laps at the IMCA on Deacon Street to build endurance without loading the joint, advice that had, over 4 months, given her back roughly 60% of what the war had taken. Her students at Everton High called her Captain Whitfield, or when they were feeling bold, Cap, and she ran her J-Trota drill team with the same exacting patience she'd once used to train 19-year-old lance corporals not to get themselves killed. There were 31 cadets in her program that year, ranging from freshmen who could barely execute a proper about-face to a handful of seniors, Deja Marsh, Tyrell Combs, and a quiet transfer student named Han Vo, who had joined in October and, within 4 months, had become the best drill commander in the unit, who Amara privately believed had genuine futures in service if they wanted them. She drilled them on the football field behind the school every morning at 6:45, rain or shine, because she believed discipline that only showed up in good weather wasn't discipline at all, and she kept a battered green composition notebook in her desk drawer where she wrote, after every practice, 1 sentence about each cadet's progress, a habit she'd carried over, without quite meaning to, from the leadership journals she'd once kept on every Marine under her command. She was, by every measure that mattered to her, building a quiet, deliberate, entirely unremarkable second life. She did not carry herself like a woman who had a bronze star in a drawer. She did not mention Sangin at dinner parties, or really anywhere else. She wore her hair natural and short, favored plain crewneck sweaters and jeans on the weekends, drove a 9-year-old Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it and a check engine light she'd been meaning to deal with since Christmas, and the only visible sign that she had ever worn a uniform was the faint, precise scar tissue along her right shoulder blade, which she covered without thinking about it, the way you cover any old wound. Her mother worried about her constantly, the silences, the way Amara sometimes stood too still in doorways, scanning a room before she'd walk through it, a habit 4 combat deployments had welded into her nervous system and that no amount of civilian life had managed to unweld. Dolores Whitfield was 63, a retired school cafeteria manager who still woke at 5 every morning out of 40 years of habit, and she had watched her only daughter leave for boot camp at 18, a laughing, restless girl, and come home at 29, someone quieter, someone who checked the locks on the back door twice before bed and flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of a dropped pan. "You're safe here, baby," Dolores told her at least once a week, usually while setting a plate of smothered pork chops or oxtail stew in front of her at the kitchen table on Sycamore Terrace. "Nobody's going to hurt you in Everton, not here." Amara would nod and say, "I know, Mama," and mean it, mostly. She loved her mother's certainty, the way it never wavered, even though some deep and practical part of Amara, the part that had spent 4 years learning exactly how fast a calm situation could turn, understood that certainty like that was usually built on the ground, never having shifted underneath you yet. Now that you've met Amara, does her story hit close to home for you? Have you known someone like her, someone who came home from serving and had to rebuild quietly, without anyone really seeing the weight they were carrying? Tell me about them in the comments. The night everything changed started, like most disasters, as something completely ordinary. It was a Tuesday, the 11th of March, and Amara had stayed late at Everton High, grading Jarocht Sage leadership journals. Deja Marsh had written 4 full pages on what she'd learned running the drill team through a rainstorm the week before, and Amara had smiled reading it, alone in her classroom. Longer than she usually let herself smile at anything, before driving to the Magnolia Diner on Route 9 for a plate of chicken and dumplings, the same $9.75 dinner she ordered most Tuesdays because the diner's owner, a 61-year-old Korean War veteran named Harold Bess, always slipped her an extra biscuit and called her Captain, with more respect in that one word than most people managed in a whole conversation. Harold had lost his left eye to shrapnel outside Chosin Reservoir 70-some years earlier, wore a thin black patch that had become as much a part of his face as his nose, and had opened the Magnolia Diner in 1988 with money saved from 30 years working the line at the textile mill before it closed. He and Amara didn't talk much about the service. Two people who'd carried that particular weight rarely needed to explain it to each other. But every Tuesday, when she sat at the same corner booth, he'd bring her plate himself, instead of sending the waitress, set it down, and say something small. That night it was, "Radio's saying rain's coming through late. You get on home before it hits, Captain." She left the diner a little after 9:40 p.m. The parking lot was mostly empty. Harold's truck, a minivan belonging to the night waitress, a 15-year-old girl named Chantel who was saving for community college, and Amara's Civic, parked under the one working sodium light at the edge of the lot near Route 9's shoulder. The other light, closer to the dumpster enclosure, had been out for 3 weeks. Harold had a work order in with the city that nobody had gotten to yet. She was 30 feet from her car when she heard it, a woman's voice, sharp and frightened, coming from the shadowed side of the lot near the dumpster enclosure, followed by a man's voice, low and furious, and the unmistakable metallic clatter of car keys hitting asphalt. Amara didn't think. 11 months out of the Corps, and her body still moved the way 4 deployments had trained it to move. Low, fast, silent, weight forward on the balls of her feet before her conscious mind had even finished processing the sound. She rounded the dumpster enclosure and found a man, later identified as 26-year-old Trey Locke, gripping the arm of a woman named Carla Denning hard enough to leave bruises, trying to wrestle a set of keys and a purse out of her hands while she screamed for help nobody in the empty lot could hear. What happened next took 11 seconds. Amara knew because she counted it later, the way she'd been trained to reconstruct incidents for after-action reports, a habit that had once saved her career and would, in a very different way, save it again. She closed the distance, redirected Locke's grip with a controlled wrist lock she'd taught 100 lance corporals in hand-to-hand training, put him face down against the side of a dumpster, with her knee against his shoulder blade, the same pressure point technique, applied with the same restraint that she'd used on detainees in Helmand who outweighed her by 80 pounds, and told Carla Denning, in the flattest, calmest voice Carla had ever heard from another human being in her life, "Call 911. Tell them there's an assault in progress at the Magnolia Diner, Route 9. Tell them the suspect is restrained." Carla, 34 years old, a dental hygienist who'd stopped at the diner for a coffee to go after a double shift, hands shaking so badly she had to try the passcode on her phone twice, dialed. Harold Bess, alerted by the noise, came out from the diner with a baseball bat he'd never once had reason to use in 19 years of ownership, his one good eye scanning the dark lot with the flat, assessing calm of a man who'd once done triage under fire and had never entirely lost the instinct. And Trey Locke, high on methamphetamine, unemployed for 4 months since losing his job at a warehouse off Route 22, 3 days behind on a payment to a man he owed considerably more than money to, screamed obscenities into the pavement, and insisted, over and over, that Amara was the one attacking him. "She's crazy, man. She came out of nowhere. Get her off me," Locke shouted, twisting under her knee, and Amara adjusted her weight with the economy of someone who had held far more dangerous men in far worse positions, and felt, if anything, a distant, clinical patience, the same patience she'd have shown a detainee, mid-interrogation, who hadn't yet realized how thoroughly the situation had already been decided. The Everton Police Department's response time to the Magnolia Diner that night was 11 minutes, which under normal circumstances would have been unremarkable. What was remarkable, what would later become the subject of an internal affairs review, a city council session, and a segment on the local NBC affiliate, was what happened when Officer Ray Dunmore and Officer Priya Talwar arrived at 9:58 p.m. and found a scene that, at first glance, offered them a choice about which story to believe. They saw a black woman kneeling over a white man face down on the pavement. They saw the man, Trey Locke, bleeding slightly from a scraped cheek and screaming that, "She jumped me, she came out of nowhere, ask anybody." They saw Carla Denning, still in shock, unable to get a coherent sentence out for the first 90 seconds, her hands still trembling around her phone. And they made a decision, in the first 90 seconds of that call, that would define the next 4 hours of Amara Whitfield's life. Officer Ray Dunmore was 38, 11 years on the force, a broad-shouldered man who coached Pop Warner football on weekends and genuinely believed, in the uncomplicated way of a man who had never had reason to examine the belief, that he was good at reading a scene fast. That instinct had served him well enough over a decade of routine calls that he had stopped questioning it, the way Sergeant Kruger had stopped questioning his own assumptions, the way institutions calcify around the shortcuts that have never yet cost them anything visible. "Ma'am, step back and put your hands where I can see them," Dunmore said, his hand already resting on his sidearm, not drawn, but present, deliberate. "I'm the one who called this in," Amara said, standing slowly, hands rising in the universal, practiced gesture of a woman who had spent 4 years training junior Marines on de-escalation, and who now, for the first time in her life, was on the receiving end of it. "The victim is Carla Denning. She's right there. The suspect assaulted her and attempted to take her keys and purse. I restrained him until you arrived. That's not what it looks like from here," Dunmore said. "I understand what it looks like," Amara said, still calm, still measured, the same voice she'd used to talk down agitated detainees at a checkpoint outside Marja. "I'm telling you what happened. Ms. Denning can confirm it. There should also be a partial security camera angle from the diner that would show the full incident. Mr. Bess can pull that footage." "We'll sort it out at the station," Dunmore cut in. "Turn around." Officer Priya Talwar, 29, 4 years on the force, stood a half step behind her partner and said nothing, though something in her posture, a slight lean forward, a longer look at Carla Denning than at either Amara or Locke, suggested she was already less certain than Dunmore about how the story should be read. She would later testify, in the Internal Affairs Review, that she had wanted to take Carla's statement on scene before anyone was cuffed, and that she had been overruled, in the informal way senior partners overrule junior ones on a scene, by Dunmore's insistence that "we process at the station, standard procedure." Amara turned around. She did not resist. She had been trained by 4 years of active duty discipline and by a lifetime as a black woman in the American South, in the precise, bitter arithmetic of exactly how much compliance kept you alive in a moment like this, and she executed that arithmetic flawlessly, chin level, shoulders relaxed, voice even, every motion legible and non-threatening, because she understood, in a way that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with survival, that this was not a moment for pride. The zip ties went on, tight enough that she felt them bite into the scar tissue on her right shoulder, a small, precise pain that she absorbed without comment. Trey Locke, still on the ground, still cuffed by the second responding unit that had arrived moments behind Dunmore and Talwar, kept insisting he was the victim, kept insisting he'd call his own lawyer, kept insisting nobody understood what that woman had done to him. And Carla Denning, finally finding her voice as she was helped up by Harold Bess, her knees still unsteady, started shouting after the officers as they walked Amara to the cruiser. "No, no, you don't understand. She saved me. He grabbed me. She's not the one." Officer Dunmore glanced back, said, "We'll get your statement, ma'am. Just give us a minute," and kept walking. Nobody stopped to listen. Not yet. After what happened to Amara in that parking lot, I need to hear your reaction. What would you have done in her position, or in Officer Dunmore's? Drop it in the comments, because I promise you, this story is only getting started. The Everton Police Department's 3rd Precinct on Holloway Street was quiet at 10:20 p.m. when Officer Dunmore walked Amara Whitfield through the intake door. And it was that quiet, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the murmur of a television playing a muted baseball rerun in the break room, the general Tuesday night boredom of a mid-sized municipal police station that made what followed feel less like malice and more like something worse. Institutional indifference, the kind that doesn't require anyone to be cruel, only for everyone to be a little too tired, a little too certain of their first impression, and a little too unwilling to slow down and check it. Desk Sergeant Dale Kruger had been on the Everton force for 24 years. He was 52 years old, divorced, 3 years from a pension, and had spent the last decade of his career mostly processing DUIs and domestic disturbance calls with the flat, weary competence of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a Tuesday night could produce. He was not, by nature, a cruel man. He coached a youth baseball league on weekends and had once spent $400 of his own money buying cleats for a kid on his team whose family couldn't afford them. But 24 years on, the force had also calcified something in him, a set of assumptions about who ended up on which side of the booking counter, assumptions he had stopped examining so long ago that he no longer noticed himself making them. "Name," he said, not looking up from his monitor. "Amara Whitfield, Captain, United States Marine Corps, retired, medically discharged. I have ID in my jacket pocket, left side." Kruger glanced at her jacket, then back at his screen, typing with 2 fingers at the unhurried pace of a man 20 minutes from the end of a long shift. "We'll get to that. Sit." She sat on the bench, back straight, hands folded in her lap, despite the zip ties, in a posture so upright and so practiced that if anyone in that hallway had actually been looking, they might have noticed it themselves, the posture of someone who had sat in far worse holding rooms, in far more dangerous places, and had learned that the body, at least, could be kept perfectly still even when everything else was not. She asked, politely, at 10:34 p.m. whether she could make a phone call. Kruger told her to wait for processing. She asked again at 10:51 p.m., her tone unchanged, still even, still without accusation. He told her the same thing, and this time added, not unkindly but not kindly either, "Ma'am, everybody wants their call. We've got a process." At 11:15 p.m., Detective Wendell Pruitt, 43 years old, ambitious, 2 years from a lieutenant's exam he'd been studying for since the previous fall, and eager to close out a straightforward assault case before the end of his shift, pulled her into an interview room and, without asking her a single open-ended question about what had actually happened, told her that her account didn't line up with what Trey Locke had told them. The interview room was small, windowless, smelling faintly of old coffee and the particular institutional disinfectant that never quite masked anything. Pruitt sat across a scarred metal table, a legal pad in front of him with barely 6 lines written on it. "He says you attacked him unprovoked," Pruitt said. "He's lying," Amara said, "and you know he's lying because you have a victim on scene, Carla Denning, who will confirm his intent was to rob or assault her, and you have a diner owner, Harold Bess, who saw the aftermath. Has anyone taken Ms. Denning's statement? We're getting to it. Has anyone pulled the diner's security footage? There's a camera angled toward the dumpster enclosure. I noticed it when I parked. It's mounted above the delivery door." Pruitt made a note, but it was the note of a man performing diligence rather than practicing it. A single line, unhurried, the pen barely touching the paper. "You were a captain," he said. Not quite a question, his tone carrying the particular skepticism of a man deciding, in real time, whether to believe a claim that complicated the story he'd already half-written in his head. "In the Marines." "Yes. And now you're a teacher." Fracture instructor, Everton High. That's a big fall, Pruitt said, and something in the way he said it. Not cruel exactly, but careless, dismissive, the verbal equivalent of a shrug. Landed on Amara harder than the zip ties had. She had given 11 years of her body to a war most of the men in this building had never had to think about. She had carried Corporal Denny Ruiz's full weight across 40 meters of open ground while her own shoulder streamed blood into the dirt. And here, in a fluorescent-lit interview room in the city where she'd grown up, a detective was implying that her rank was either a lie or a demotion, a story too convenient, too flattering, to be trusted from a woman who'd been found kneeling over a bleeding white man in a parking lot. She let the comment sit for a second before answering, because she had learned long ago, in briefing rooms, in checkpoints, in rooms exactly like this one, though none quite so close to home, that the fastest way to lose an argument with a man like Pruitt was to let him see that he'd landed a blow. I left because an IED took 40% of the function in my right shoulder, and I couldn't pass a fitness test anymore, she said, not because anything about my rank was in question. You can call Camp Lejeune's personnel office in the morning if you'd like to verify that, or you can look at the discharge paperwork in my apartment, which I'd be happy to have you retrieve with my consent. But right now, Detective, there's a woman named Carla Denning, somewhere in this building, who watched a man try to take her keys and her purse by force. And every minute you spend asking me about my career, instead of confirming her statement, is a minute you're choosing not to do your job. Pruitt's jaw tightened. Save it for the arraignment, he said, standing, gathering his notepad. We'll get your side sorted. She sat in that interview room, then back on the bench in the hallway, for 2 more hours. Her one phone call, finally granted at 11:50 p.m., went to her mother, who answered on the second ring, her voice already sharp with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent 40 years waking at 5 a.m. and had never fully learned how to sleep deeply again. "They arrested you? For what, baby? For what?" Dolores Whitfield was already pulling on her coat before the call ended, already dialing a cousin who did paralegal work downtown, a soft-spoken woman named Renata Boyce, who had spent 11 years at a firm on Delacroix Road, handling everything from wills to the occasional wrongful arrest complaint, already doing the thing generations of black mothers in Everton had learned to do the moment those words, arrested, station, hold on, entered a phone call. Dolores did not cry. She had promised herself, standing in that kitchen with the phone still warm in her hand, that she would not let her daughter hear her cry. Not tonight. Not until this was over. At the diner, meanwhile, Harold Bess had pulled up the security footage on his ancient DVR system and was trying, without success, to get a second patrol officer to actually watch it. The officer, a young patrolman named Cody Fitch, who'd been dispatched to canvass the diner as a formality, told Harold he'd noted in the report and left without so much as glancing at the screen. Harold, furious in a way he hadn't been furious in years, called the precinct's non-emergency line at 12:10 a.m. and asked, flatly, to speak to whoever was in charge of the Whitfield case. He was put on hold for 6 minutes and then disconnected. Carla Denning, still shaking, had given a full statement to Officer Talwar, the one officer on scene who had, from the start, quietly doubted the version of events her partner had settled on, describing in detail how Trey Locke had grabbed her, how the woman had appeared like she knew exactly what she was doing, like she wasn't scared for 1 second, how she had never, not for 1 second, felt that the woman restraining Locke was a threat to her. Talwar took the statement by hand at 12:15 a.m., typed it up at 12:30, and drove it back to the 3rd Precinct herself rather than radioing it in, because some instinct told her that if she didn't put it physically into someone's hands, it would sit in a queue until morning. Officer Talwar arrived at 12:40 a.m. and found Amara Whitfield still sitting on the bench, hands now cuffed in front of her instead of behind, a small mercy Kruger had allowed around midnight without comment, staring at the middle distance with the particular, terrible stillness of someone who has decided, out of exhausted necessity, to simply outlast the moment rather than fight it. Right now, Amara is about to make a move that could change everything. Before I tell you what she did next, what would your next move be, sitting on that bench for 4 hours? Tell me in the comments. What Amara Whitfield did at 12:47 a.m. was ask Sergeant Kruger, for the third time in the same level, unhurried voice she'd used the first 2 times, a single question. "Sergeant, has anyone called Lieutenant Marcus Felt's unit tonight? I heard radio traffic about a hostage situation on Route 12 when I was brought in. Is that active?" Kruger, startled that she'd caught that detail through the ambient chaos of the precinct, glanced up at her properly for the first time all night. "That's not your concern." "It might be," Amara said, "if it's who I think it is." Trey Locke, it turned out, was not merely a desperate man trying to steal a purse. He was 3 days behind on a $4,000 debt to a small-time methamphetamine distributor named Curtis Boyle, and Boyle, informed by a mutual acquaintance that Locke had just been arrested and might, under pressure, start talking, had made a catastrophic decision at approximately 11:30 p.m. He'd driven to the Sunrise Motel on Route 12, where his own supplier, a man known only by the alias Deacon, was staying in room 14, intending to collect money owed to him before word of Locke's arrest could ripple outward and collapse the whole fragile arrangement. The confrontation went wrong. Boyle, panicked and armed with a .38 revolver he'd bought off a man in a bar parking lot 2 years earlier and never once fired, ended up barricaded in room 14 with the motel's night manager, 67-year-old Ellis Cardwell, held at gunpoint as an unwilling hostage after Cardwell had the misfortune of knocking on the door about a noise complaint at exactly the wrong moment. By 12:15 a.m., the Everton Police Department had requested mutual aid from the Everton Regional Tactical Unit, the department's SWAT team, jointly funded by the city and the county, and Lieutenant Marcus Felt, its commander, was en route to Route 12 with a 5-man entry team. Sergeant Cole Anders, Corporal Bo Whitlock, Officer Dario Reyes, and 2 junior tactical officers on their first live call-out, all of them following Felt's voice over the radio net, with the particular trust that only comes from months of drilling under someone who has never once, in a live situation, made a decision that put them somewhere he wouldn't have gone himself. What almost nobody at the 3rd Precinct knew that night, and what Amara Whitfield had recognized instantly the moment she heard Felt's name over the radio traffic filtering through the bullpen, was that Marcus Felt had once been a 19-year-old lance corporal in her platoon, in a military police company deployed to a forward operating base 60 kilometers south of Kandahar during a summer that neither of them would ever fully stop carrying with them. On a July night 9 years earlier, then Sergeant Amara Whitfield had led a 4-vehicle convoy through a stretch of road her unit called the Funnel because of how it channeled traffic between 2 ridgelines that made ambush nearly guaranteed. The convoy was hit. Lance Corporal Marcus Felt, driving the 2nd vehicle, took small arms fire through the door panel that shattered his femur and put him on the ground in the open, exposed, screaming, 20 meters from any cover. Amara, then a 20-year-old sergeant with 18 months in country, left the relative safety of her own position, crossed that 20 meters under fire, got a tourniquet on Felt's leg, and dragged him back to cover, while return fire from her squad kept the ambush suppressed long enough for a medevac to reach them. Felt kept his leg. He kept his life. And in the 9 years since, he had never once stopped telling the story to anyone who would listen, how his commanding sergeant, a black woman barely older than he was, had run into open fire to save a lance corporal she outranked by 6 years and outweighed by nothing at all, and how that 30 seconds had reshaped every decision he'd made about the kind of officer and the kind of man he wanted to become. He had left the Corps 4 years later, joined the Everton Police Department, worked his way onto the tactical unit, and eventually into its command, carrying the entire time a small folded photograph in his wallet of a woman in desert camis with sergeant's chevrons on her collar, the same photograph he still carried the night he pulled up to the Sunrise Motel on Route 12 and coordinated, over the next 2 hours, a textbook, patient, zero-casualty resolution of the Curtis Boyle hostage situation. He'd set a perimeter, gotten a trained negotiator, a soft-spoken county contractor named Priscilla Odom, on a throw phone with Boyle by 1:15 a.m., and spent the next hour listening to her walk Boyle down from the ledge he'd put himself on, one sentence at a time, while Felt's entry team held position and waited for the moment. And it always came, if you were patient enough and disciplined enough not to force it, when the man inside ran out of reasons to keep pointing the gun at anyone. Room 14 was cleared at 2:14 a.m. without a shot fired, and Ellis Cardwell walked out with nothing worse than a badly frightened night and a story he'd tell at the motel's front desk for years to come. It was standard procedure, after a resolved tactical call-out involving an arrest connected to an open case at another precinct, for the tactical commander to debrief with the detective handling the related matter, which was how, at 2:41 a.m., Lieutenant Marcus Felt walked into the booking hallway of the Everton 3rd Precinct to speak with Detective Pruitt about the Curtis Boyle arrest and its connection to Trey Locke, and saw, sitting on a bench in a posture she couldn't have unlearned if she'd tried, a woman whose face he would have recognized in absolute darkness, in a crowd of 10,000, on the worst night of his life or the best one. Amara's voice was finally heard in that hallway. But here's what I want to know. Have you ever had a moment where you stood your ground, waited it out, and the truth finally came to light? Share that story in the comments. Someone watching tonight needs to hear it. The salute lasted perhaps 4 seconds, but every person in that hallway would describe it, months later, as feeling like it lasted much longer. "Discharged 11 months ago, Lieutenant," Amara said, and something in the way Felt's shoulders dropped, not out of relaxation, but out of the particular fury of a man realizing exactly what his own department had done to the woman who'd once carried him out of an ambush, told everyone watching that whatever was about to happen, it was not going to be quiet. "Get those ties off her," Felt said. His voice had shifted registers entirely, from the clipped calm of tactical command to something with an edge that made even Sergeant Kruger flinch. "Now, Lieutenant, this woman is a suspect in an ongoing assault investigation," Detective Pruitt started, stepping forward with the last, thin authority of a man still trying to believe his version of the night was correct. "This woman," Felt said, and his voice carried down the hallway loud enough that 2 patrol officers came out of the break room to see what was happening, "is Captain Amara Whitfield, United States Marine Corps, Bronze Star with Valor, and she is the reason I have walked on both my legs for the last 9 years, instead of neither of them. She crossed open ground under fire to drag me out of a kill zone when I was 19 years old and screaming for my mother. So before you say one more word about what she is or is not a suspect in, I strongly suggest you go find whatever evidence exists in this case that you apparently have not looked at, and I suggest you look at it right now, in front of me." The zip ties came off at 2:44 a.m., Corporal Whitlock cutting them himself with the small folding knife he carried on his vest, his hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the 2 hours of tactical work he'd just finished, and everything to do with what he was watching unfold in front of him. Officer Talwar, who had never fully believed the story Pruitt and Dunmore had settled on, stepped forward and produced Carla Denning's statement, the one she'd been sitting on for nearly 2 hours, because nobody with the authority to act on it had made it a priority. It corroborated everything Amara had said, word for word. Harold Bess's security footage, finally pulled and reviewed at 3:10 a.m. by a visibly ashen Sergeant Kruger, who drove to the diner himself, rather than wait for morning, showed the entire 11-second altercation exactly as Amara had described it. Trey Locke gripping Carla Denning's arm, the struggle over her keys and purse, Amara's arrival, the controlled takedown. Nothing more and nothing less. Trey Locke, who had spent 4 hours insisting he was the victim, was formally charged at 4:20 a.m. with attempted robbery and assault, and would later, facing the weight of Carla Denning's statement, the footage, and his own prior record, accept a plea agreement that included 18 months at a state facility and mandatory substance abuse treatment. Curtis Boyle, arrested without incident at the Sunrise Motel, faced far more serious charges: kidnapping, aggravated assault, distribution, that would eventually earn him a 9-year sentence at a state penitentiary 200 miles from Everton. Amara Whitfield was released from the Everton 3rd Precinct at 3:35 a.m., not with an apology at first. That would come later, and imperfectly, the way institutional apologies usually do, but with a formal notation in the department's log, initiated by Lieutenant Felt personally, that read, "Detainment of Capt. A. Whitfield, determined to be procedurally deficient. Full review requested. Involved personnel: Sergeant D. Kruger, Det. W. Pruitt, Ov. C.R. Dunmore." Her mother was waiting in the parking lot when she walked out, Renata Boyce beside her with a legal pad already half full of notes for a formal complaint neither of them would end up needing to file, because the department, to its credit, moved faster than either woman expected once Felt's name was attached to the file. Dolores didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped both arms around her daughter, careful of the shoulder, and held on until Amara, who had not cried once in 4 hours on that bench, not when the ties bit into her skin, not when Pruitt called her career a big fall, finally let herself exhale, once, long and shaking, into her mother's coat. The review took 6 weeks. It was not, in the end, the clean, cinematic reckoning that viral stories sometimes promise and rarely deliver. Officer Ray Dunmore, whose initial snap judgment in the parking lot had set the entire chain of events in motion, was suspended for 15 days without pay and mandated into a 40-hour implicit bias and de-escalation retraining program administered by a nonprofit called the Coastal Justice Institute at a cost of $2,400 to the department. He would later tell a colleague, quietly, over coffee, that the training had been the first time in 11 years anyone had asked him to actually walk back through his first 90 seconds on a scene and account for every assumption baked into them, and that he hadn't liked what he found when he did. Detective Wendell Pruitt, whose lieutenant's exam ambitions had made him careless with a case he'd wanted closed rather than solved, received a formal written reprimand in his personnel file and was passed over for that year's promotion cycle, a consequence that stung him considerably more than the 15-day suspension had stung Dunmore. He did not, in the weeks that followed, ever manage a real conversation with Amara about what he'd said to her. That's a big fall. Though he thought about it, by his own later admission to the review board, more than he thought about almost anything else that spring. Sergeant Dale Kruger's case was the most complicated and the most human. He was not fired. He was not, in the strictest legal sense, found to have violated any specific department policy. He had, after all, followed the letter of standard booking procedure, even if he had followed it with a coldness and an incuriosity that had cost an innocent, decorated combat veteran 4 hours of her freedom and considerably more than that in dignity. He was required to complete the same retraining as Dunmore. He was also required, at the recommendation of the review board and with Amara's own explicit input, to sit down with her directly, not in an interview room, but at the Magnolia Diner, over 2 cups of Harold Bess's coffee, and hear, in her own words, exactly what those 4 hours had cost her. He did not defend himself in that conversation. He told her, plainly, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he didn't drink from, that he had stopped seeing the people in front of him a long time ago and started seeing only the shapes their situations made, and that he was ashamed of it. He told her about the $400 of cleats, about the 24 years, about a divorce he still didn't fully understand the reasons for, not because any of it excused what he'd done, but because he wanted her to understand that he knew, now, exactly what kind of man had let her sit on that bench, and that he intended to be a different one. He did not ask for forgiveness, and Amara did not offer it easily or immediately. She told him, "I don't need you to feel bad, Sergeant. I need you to look at the next person who sits on that bench." He nodded, and meant it, and 3 weeks later, when the Everton City Council held a public session to discuss the incident and vote on new department-wide procedures, mandatory review of victim and witness statements before any suspect is formally processed, expanded use of body cameras, an independent review board with civilian oversight, it was Dale Kruger, not Marcus Felt, who stood at the podium and, in a shaking voice, described the exact moment he'd realized what he had done, and urged the council to pass every reform on the table. The council chamber that night was fuller than usual, word having spread through Everton the way it does in a city that size. Harold Best sat in the third row with Chantel, the waitress, beside him. Carla Denning came and gave a brief, still-shaken statement of her own, and Deja Marsh and Tyrell Combs sat near the back in their Giorgio uniforms, having asked Amara's permission first, because they'd wanted, in their own words, to see what it looks like when things actually get fixed. The council passed all of it, unanimously, at a session that ran until nearly midnight and drew coverage from the local NBC affiliate, Wetton Channel 9, whose report on "The Veteran Mistaken for a Suspect" ran for 2 consecutive nights and prompted the department's chief, a measured, gray-haired man named Chief Roland Petty, in a rare public statement, to acknowledge that our systems failed Captain Whitfield before any individual officer did, and we are responsible for both. Today, nearly a year later, Amara Whitfield is still the Giorgio instructor at Everton High School, still drives the same 9-year-old Civic, the check engine light finally fixed last summer, a bad oxygen sensor, $41 at a shop on Route 9, still orders the chicken and dumplings at the Magnolia Diner most Tuesdays, where Harold Best still slips her an extra biscuit, now alongside a laminated newspaper clipping he keeps taped behind the register. Her shoulder still aches in cold weather, and she still sees Oren Castellano twice a month instead of 3 times a week now, mostly for maintenance, mostly because she no longer needs it the way she once did. She still, some nights, stands a beat too long in doorways before walking through them. But something has shifted, too. She sits on the Everton Police Department's newly formed Community Oversight Advisory Board, a seat she accepted reluctantly and now occupies with the same exacting seriousness she once brought to training junior Marines, not because the board fixes everything, but because she has learned, in the hardest possible way, that the systems meant to protect people only get better when the people harmed by them insist on staying in the room. Lieutenant Marcus Felt still carries the folded photograph in his wallet, though these days he doesn't need it to remember her face. He sees her most weeks, at council sessions, at the diner, at the high school where he now occasionally guest speaks to her J. Roach cadets about tactical leadership, always making a point, every single time, to introduce her first, by her full rank, before he says another word. Amara doesn't tell the story often. She doesn't need to. It's not who she is. It's just one night, 4 hours, in a much longer life she's still quietly building, 1 drill practice and 1 physical therapy session and 1 Tuesday dinner at a time. But when her cadets ask her, as teenagers eventually do, what real leadership looks like under pressure, she doesn't talk about Sangin, or the convoy, or the Bronze Star sitting in a small blue box in her mother's china cabinet. She tells them about a bench, and 4 hours, and the particular, exhausting discipline it takes to hold your composure when the truth is on your side and nobody around you is listening yet. You wait, she tells them, you stay exactly who you are. And eventually, the truth catches up to the room. If this story resonated with you, or if you've lived through a moment when the truth finally caught up to the room around you, Tell me about it in the comments below. Every voice deserves to be heard, and I read every single one.